Hello, welcome to this Halion 6 tutorial series. Today we're talking about the slice editor. So we're slicing samples here, and in order to do that we need a sample. So let's create a slot and a layer and a sample zone, and this time we're going to choose a sample that we're going to be able to chop up into bits, and perfect examples for those kinds of things are beats. So if I go over to my media bay and drag a beat in, let's have this fella. So as things stand at the moment, we have a regular sample. If I play it, it's a beat. You can see all the different beats in the sample viewer, and that's what we're going to use to determine where the transients are, in order that we can chop up all of those. Thank you, loud motorbike. We're going to chop up that sample into sections so that we can deal with each beat individually, and we get to it through the slice tab, and we're in transient mode here. So you can see all of these markers that are like pre-inserted. They're controlled by this threshold knob. The more I turn threshold up, those parallel red lines separate, and the transient has to intersect that line in order to generate a marker. So this is the size of the slices that we're going to create, and you kind of gain a bit of an intuition for the types of numbers of slices that you want. Now let's say that's more or less right, but experience teaches us that over here these are a little bit too close together. We have this min length value that if we start slowly dialing this up, then some of those that were a little bit too close together for our liking, they're going to make slices that are a little bit too small. They get thrown away. So between those two, we've got it covered. Sensitivity is all about the quality of the transient. So if we dial this up, we're going to start losing some of those transients because they don't meet the kind of quality rating. The internal Halion has its own means of identifying transients and pitches and amplitudes, and the sensitivity knob wraps all of that up and says how certain Halion is that a thing is a thing. Generally speaking, I'm kind of happy leaving sensitivity at 0. It tends to serve me better than dialing this up, but you can, if there are some that you think, oh, that's kind of it's not quite identified that correctly, then increasing the sensitivity knob will help you to filter out some of those mistakes. But it's really an organic process. Mess around with these knobs, and all of this is in theory. You've not seen it working yet, so let's just crack on and actually create some slices, and then you'll start to see how the thing works. So having generated my markers, I'm going to click this apply button, and now all of the controls down here change, but we're not going to worry about those just yet. I want to get to the stage where you can see it. So each one of these zones that's been auto-generated represents one of these tiny slices, and at the very top we have this thing called the slice player, and that's going to let us control like holistic data about the entire piece. But for now we're just going to pick this little MIDI icon up over here, drag MIDI phrase to host sequencer. We're going to do that. I'm going to drop it into Halion, close this window, and now let's have a look what we've got. We've got a load of stepped notes that represent that beat, but it's been chopped up into small notes. Each one of those notes represents part of the beat. And if I play this, now I've preset the DAW to 77 BPM because when I was working out which example I was going to use, I saw that the imported sample was recorded at 77 BPM. And now when I play this, so just to clarify, it's not playing that entire sample as one thing. It's playing these notes, and these notes correspond to parts of the sample. What this lets us do now is if I select some of these notes and move them, We have complete flexibility, beat by beat, transient by transient, of how we want this thing to sound. And we can play them individually on the keyboard. So there's C3. It's just that tiny little segment of the entire sample. And there's C sharp. So if I play the notes kind of ascending, you get an idea for what the beat would sound like, but of course the different lengths, so it's not going to be perfect. I would have to play a 16th and then 3/16ths and then an 1/8, and I would have to get all of the timings right in order to make it sound perfect. And you might think, well, that's unwieldy. Sometimes I just want to hear the entire thing played in its own right. Well, I'm pressing a single note here, and I'm hearing the whole sample. So what gives? The reason that happens is because if we go back over to our sample viewer and have a look at your virtual keyboard down at the bottom, it's telling you that the slices that we've just generated from this sample are mapped from C3 up to D5. And so any of the notes that I play in that range, here's a C4, is that bit of the sample. And the highest note is this D5 up here. I play a D sharp 5. Well, that actually is mapped, and E isn't. So yeah, the highest note is D sharp 5. It's just not quite so easy because it's not coloured white. The green keys down here are a tempo-based interpretation of the entire sample. If we jump briefly up to this slice player over here, which is the thing that kind of, it's a meta description, if you like, of all of the zones underneath. We have a look at that very briefly. We'll see this center key is C2, which means this green key here is the natural place where the entire sample plays at the correct speed. But all of those green keys play the sample. So if I play a C1, see, it's tuned it so that all of the samples are now playing lower, but it's still playing it at 77 BPM. If I go to an A sharp 2, again, it's tuned all the beats. They just happen to be beats in this sense, but if they were keyboard sounds, they would all be tuned up so they're playing at the correct pitch, but they're still playing at 77 BPM. And everything from C3 onwards is just the like one-shot version of that slice of time. So let's have a look at what's going on in all of these zones. Each one of these zones looks at, it can still see the entire sample. Remember, sample editing is all about kind of non-destructive layering on top of an underlying wave file. So even though we've selected this zone of 001, if we zoom in a little bit, you can see that this first zone over here is selected. If I click zone 2, it now selects the second zone. If I click the play button, this play button says play slice tool, slightly different. And now when I click inside the zone with my play slice tool activated, it doesn't matter where in this little coloured region I click, it just plays that zone. Each zone that I click in auto selects that zone and then plays it. Let's say, having auditioned the thing, we decide that we're not that happy with the slices that have been created and we want to create a new one here. If I click Alt, click, it creates a new marker, and it's now inserted a new zone corresponding to that. And now we have a new key on the keyboard, which is E. And this means, of course, this loop that we dragged out earlier is no longer correct because those notes only went up to D sharp 5. So when we dragged those notes out of the slice editor, it was a snapshot of all of the settings we plugged in to the slice editor at that moment in time. So let's get rid of this because it'll just confuse us otherwise. And go back over here and zoom out. Now we see that as soon as we clicked the apply button, all of the controls down here changed, and I said don't worry about it for now, we'll come back later. Well, let's have a quick look at what's going on. Each one of these slices is completely independently editable. We can reverse the playback of them. If I multi-select a big chunk of these and put all of those into playback reverse mode, so now all of these slices at the beginning of the sample, zones 2 to 11, are going to play reversed, and then it'll catch up and start playing forwards again. Each one of these zones down here is still in normal mode. And then we've switched to forward mode again. So every single one can be treated completely individually. Reverse those as well. And there we go, we've gone back into reverse mode again. And then we just finish off with a little bit of forward motion at the end. If we think, yeah, that's really cool, I like that, grab our little MIDI icon, drag that out into Cubase, shut this temporarily, and now this basically sequence, if I play it, okay, really cool. We also have independent filtering that we can apply to every one of these slices. So let's just make a random selection of these zones over here. Really dull and thuddy. Let's see what that sounds like. There's the dull bit. And then we come back again. So the flexibility, the editing flexibility of each one of these slices, again, it's kind of a subset of all of the other functionality you get just wrapped inside this little slice editor. It's all about building interesting things with primarily loops. It's really designed for loops, but you could do this chromatically. If you had like a sequence, an arpeggio, you would be able to apply exactly the same fundamental principles to it. I'm going to throw all of that editing away and go back to our principle. So it's all gone and we're back down to our raw sample again, which is there. Let's recreate the slices, and now all of that editing that I did previously is all gone and we're completely back to square one, just with the raw sample as sliced. And let's have a look at some of the features in the slice player. So we select the slice player and then click the sound tab, which gives us the context sensitive view on the currently selected program item. So let's see what's going on over here. Well, first things first, we've got this little MIDI icon again. So this allows us to do exactly the same thing. Drag the sample out and play it from the keyboard. And by default it's mapped it to C2, so I'm playing a C2 here. There it is. But if I play a F2 instead, plays all the samples, pitch raised, but at the same speed. Get rid of that. We have 8 variations that once we've done editing in here, we can assign those variations to one of these 8 controls. So everything that we're doing at the moment is on variation 1. We don't have to do anything else to select one of these 8 slots. We just get slot 1 straight out of the gate. Okay, so I've redrawn some of the windows so that we can see everything nice and conveniently, and we've got this 4-bar part that's just playing the sample absolutely natively. Simple as you like. Okay, let's have a look at some of the options available to us. Firstly, if I turn hold on, that's pretty obvious. It just starts playing and doesn't stop. If we have loop engaged, it literally won't stop. If I turn loop off, it'll finish once it gets to the end of the sample. In restart mode, let's cut a bit of this out and to turn this back on again. Every time it hits a new note, it starts playing the sample from the beginning again because restart mode is off. If I put restart mode in sync to host, now it carries on playing the sample from where it was. It's basically mapped that sample to the transport, and wherever I jump to in the song, it will play that part of the sample at that point in time. Doesn't matter, it's not interested in note-ons, it's interested in position. Now we can achieve a similar effect to that via a slightly circuitous route. If I move this one beat forward, now when I begin the sample, it's still synced to the host transport underneath. So the beginning of the part that I'm playing, the event that I'm playing, isn't actually the beginning of the sample. We're missing that first beat. If I switch back to restart mode off and put hold onto gated, now when it receives its first note on, it's going to start playing the sample in the background, and then if it hits a gap, it'll catch back up again when you start. So at this point, it's all about receiving the first instruction to begin playing, and then from that point onwards, it will carry on playing the sample, and it doesn't matter how many note on and note offs you have. It's now kind of transport based. If we set trigger mode to next beat and cut out a little section here, and move us back to the beginning of the song so it's nice and convenient. Don't want to get confused with too many offsets. Now when it receives a note on instruction, it will ignore it until it gets to the next beat, and then it'll start playing. And for next measure, a measure is basically a bar. So it's going to miss out that entire second note. It's not going to play anything of it. And then it catches back up again because that's the beginning of the next bar. If I stuck those two things together, we'll get exactly the same result. There you go. Gated is really cool. If I get this thing playing, so I'm just holding the key down on the keyboard here. Now it's truncated all of the notes. Each one of the slices, however long it is only 27% that long. So if I drag that MIDI pattern out into the editor, you can see all of the notes are 27% of the length that they're supposed to be. And now when I play that sequence, it sounds exactly like it did when I pressed the note down and held it. So when you do that MIDI drag, it just basically says what are all my settings at the moment. So I'm going to generate a MIDI representation of that data. And we've always got our native samples mapped to C3 and above here. Playing each one of those keys individually and kind of running up the sample. That's what it's doing when you drag one of those MIDI patterns out. So gating is really cool for kind of tightening the drum sound up. We can also introduce swing, so I'll just hold the note down. There you go, started to introduce swing into the beat. Don't forget, it's got all of these slices and it's in complete control of how all of those slices are handled. So we're in the slice player here, looking at all of these zones and applying these kind of meta controls to those zones. If we turn sync off, obviously we just get a pure tempo control. We're no longer mapped to the host. It's pretty obvious. In quantize mode, just set everything back to a default and drag the MIDI pattern out. You can see all of the notes set to 16ths. If I quantize this to 1/8, as things stand at the moment, you're going to see no difference whatsoever. Everything is still set to 16ths. That's because I haven't applied any of that quantization. It's an amount based setting. If I set it to 100% and drag the thing out, they've been moved to the 8th note position instead. So now we're playing 2 samples at the same time. Key follow is all about the keyboard mapping of all of these green notes at the bottom. So if I play a C2, there's my natural beat. If I play a C1, it's the beat detuned by an octave. You can hear it raising in pitch. The key follow slope is basically being shallowed out. So at 0, C1 and C2 will sound exactly the same. Here's C2, here's C1. So we're not pitch altering the tone of the sound anymore. If I go over to preset 2, I go back to a new set of options, and I now have like full gating again. I have this wonderful little random button which completely alters the sequence underneath the hood. So now I've got a totally different sequence. It's just remapped all of those slices randomly. Back in variation 1, we've still got our standard rhythm. If I drag variation 2 out into the MIDI editor, we can see the randomly assigned MIDI notes. If I want to generate different random patterns for different variations, go to variation 3, click this trigger button, it refires the randomization, it says generate me a new random pattern. Variation 4, trigger again, and now each one of these patterns sounds completely different. I can drag each of them out, and then I might be kind of like most of it, but a couple of things I don't particularly like, move them around to my heart's content. I've got a brand new pattern. So almost bafflingly flexible. You know, there's an awful lot you can do with here, but you don't need to actually jump that far down the rabbit hole to get awesome results. If you go right back to the beginning where we started, and just, if I revert, I've just thrown all of that away. It's all gone. When I apply my slice again, I'm back to my standard slice player with no options having been set, and it just sounds great right out of the box. Having that flexibility to be able to edit all of those slices and add filtering and reverse some of them, you just get, you know, really, really cool effects. The world's your oyster. So dive in, have a bit of a play. Nothing like getting your feet wet on something like this. You know, drag a loop in, mess with your thresholds, just click apply, and then start playing with the MIDI notes and see what you can come up with. Really kind of inspiringly creative. That's all for this one. Thanks very much for watching. Hope you consider subscribing and hit notifications, and then you'll find out when the next episode of this series comes out. Hope to see you then.